Demolition Derby. It was the day of SpongeBob's boat driving test. As he pedaled through Bikini Bottom, he whistled happily and called out to his friends, "Don't bother wishing me luck because I don't need it. I'm ready, 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 ready!" When he reached the boarding school, SpongeBob jumped into a boat with Mrs. Puff. "I'm not ready," Mrs. Puff said with a sigh. SpongeBob fastened his seatbelt, turned the key, stepped on the gas, and slammed into the boat in front of him. When he backed up, he hit the boat behind him. Boom! Smash! Kabash! He couldn't get out of the parking space, and with each crash, Mrs. Puff blew up bigger and bigger. Mrs. Puff blew up so big that the boat started to float. It went higher and higher. "Good thing we're in the air, Mrs. Puff," SpongeBob said. "One more crash and you'd pop for sure." She and SpongeBob sailed closer and closer to a lighthouse until... boom! Pop! At the hospital, a doctor explained that Mrs. Puff had ruptured her inflation sac. "I'm afraid you might never puff again," he said. "Maybe we should start calling you Mrs. Puff," suggested SpongeBob. Mrs. Puff needed rest to get better, but SpongeBob visited every day. He filled her room with balloons and flowers. The flowers made her sneeze. "SpongeBob, why can't you just graduate out of my life?" she moaned. "Oh, Mrs. Puff, you just need to get out of this stuffy room," SpongeBob said. "Let's go for a ride." As SpongeBob pushed Mrs. Puff in her wheelchair, several injured fish were rushed into the emergency room. "Oh, these are just the latest injuries from the local Demolition Derby," explained the doctor. "Smashing boats for entertainment is very dangerous. These guys must never drive again." "Never drive again?" Mrs. Puff liked the sound of that. She came up with a plan. "SpongeBob," she said, "how would you like to earn some extra credit?" When Mrs. Puff left the hospital, she brought SpongeBob to meet the head of the Demolition Derby, Captain Lutefisk. "I'd be happy to let this little fella enter the Derby, but he looks a little soft," Captain Lutefisk said. Bleh. "He's going to need a scary identity. The Derby is all about image." He thought for a moment. "I've got it." He peeled off his sock, snipped it with scissors, and stretched it over SpongeBob. "I give you the squish." Yay! That afternoon, SpongeBob rolled up to the starting line at the Demolition Derby. The other boats were much bigger. The drivers had names like the Cruncher, Blowtorch, and the Crackling Cruiser. They weren't afraid of SpongeBob's tiny boat. "Let the demolition begin!" shouted Captain Lutefisk. "Squash the squish!" Mrs. Puff shouted from the stands. Engines roared, tires skidded, boats swerved and screeched. The Cruncher had SpongeBob in his sights, but SpongeBob carefully signaled and turned. The Cruncher shot past him and kerbash! Collided with the Crackling Cruiser. Blowtorch revved his engine. Flames flew from the exhaust pipes. He raced towards SpongeBob. "I'll get you!" Blowtorch growled, but SpongeBob's little boat bounced off Blowtorch's monster machine. SpongeBob flew into the air and landed unharmed. Blowtorch crashed into the stadium wall. One by one, every boat was ruined except SpongeBob's. SpongeBob was the winner! Mrs. Puff couldn't believe it. She jumped out of the stands and hopped into a giant monster boat. "If you want someone demolished," she said, "you have to demolish him yourself!" Mrs. Puff started the engine and roared after SpongeBob. She chased him right out of the stadium and down the street. And crashed into the boating school. When the dust cleared, SpongeBob saw an amazing sight. "Mrs. Puff, you're all puffy again!" he cried. "Oh, thank goodness! Now everything is back to normal!" "Yes," muttered a weary Mrs. Puff. "Perfectly normal." "So, how much extra credit did I earn?" SpongeBob asked. The end.